And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second ever thesis panel at a Signum University, Mythmoot. Do I have a ring?
Pointing right at the speaker button.
Is that why?
Yeah.
I actually moved myself. Will that help?
Oh.
Okay, thank you very much. So our panel title is War and Peace, Tolkien and Lewis on Legend and Politics. Actually, I think we changed the title a little bit after.
That's yesterday. That's yesterday.
No, it's after we switched Cynthia around. I have the right people in front of me.
Yeah.
Let's get to the important part, the people and their topics. So
Women and men.
we
right?
have Catherine Neville, aka Kate Niggle, who has just recently completed her MA in Tolkien Studies here. Her previous degree is a 1975 Bachelor of Arts from Vassar College. During the intervening years, she was mostly occupied with raising 3 children and performing in over 50 theatrical productions, ranging from Twelfth Night to Sweeney Todd. She now keeps the books for her husband's online publishing business, serves on the board of the local public library, is active in her local church, and continues to study Tolkien. Alyssa House-Thomas is on staff at Signum University. Her scholarly interests include Tolkien studies, speculative fiction, and the literatures of early medieval England and late medieval Scandinavia. And Courtney Petrucci received her Bachelor of Arts in Sciences in Secondary Education English from Salve Regina University in 2013. She's a certified teacher in Connecticut and Rhode Island and just completed her first year teaching grade 9 English at Kinsella Magnet School of Performing Arts in Hartford, Connecticut. Courtney also teaches English to international students at the Suffield Academy Summer Program and teaches dance at a local studio in her huge amount of spare time. Courtney is honored to be a student here and is excited to continue taking courses with such inspiring people. Uh-oh, are you going to keep auditing even when you're done? Yeah. Excellent. Very good.
I'm still doing.
So we will have our 3 presentations first, and we'll have a slightly extended time for Q&A after. So, Kate, take it away.
But suddenly some power, descended from of old from divine race, possessed Luthien, and casting back her foul raiment, she stood forth, small before the might of Karkaroth, but radiant and terrible. The song of Luthien before Mandos was the song most fair that ever in words was woven, and the song most sorrowful that ever the world shall hear. Unchanged, imperishable, it is sung still in Valinor, beyond the hearing of the world, and listening, the Valar are grieved. This is the image of Luthien which I have had since 1977, when I purchased the Silmarillion, finally produced by Christopher Tolkien from the notes and writings of his father, J.R.R. Tolkien. When I began recently to seriously study the History of Middle-earth series, I experienced a sense of cognitive dissonance as I read the tale of Tinuviel in the Book of Lost Tales 2. Little Tinuviel could never be called radiant and terrible, and she is almost entirely defined by dance rather than song. Tinuviel's joy was rather in the dance, and no names are set with hers for the beauty and subtlety of her twinkling feet, nor may any see such lilting, save be it only in the rose gardens of Valinor, where Nessa dances on the lawns of never-fading green. I wondered how Tolkien shaped the pretty little fairy princess of the Lost Tales into the most powerful female born into Arda, whose story is the kernel of the mythology. And that was my start. And when I started, a year or so ago, my idea was to go from 1917, when he first wrote it, all the way up to 77. My crest has since fallen, and I take it only up through the end of the Leesburg when he stopped writing that. And one of the first things I did, outside of reading everything I could on Luthien, Tinuviel, Tolkien, song, music, dance, yada, was to make a spreadsheet. And this is a little version of it. It turned out to be very helpful. I have a column for what was going on in his personal life, the Luthien-related material that he wrote, his other Middle-earth writing, his employment, his scholarship, and other unrelated stuff. And it was very helpful. I mean, if you're doing anything where you're tracking Tolkien on your time, it helped to focus what to look at when I was studying how he developed Luthien. And I discovered a very interesting thing was when he turned to writing Luthien, he was at the same time working on Pearl and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and some Chaucer, So I was able to turn to those and look for scholarship about Pearl and those works in order to find some inspiration, and that was very useful. The other interesting thing that I discovered, which I discussed in the paper I gave yesterday, was the importance of Light as Leaf on Linden Tree, which to me, I still consider the fourth version of their story, and no one ever does. Because he wrote it sort of in between the Tale of Tenuville and the Lay of Luthien, and it changed a little bit about who she was. And little bits of it show up again in the Lay of Luthien. So that's pretty much the way I went through, and I found some interesting things in the development. Again, the Pearl, I think, is a really good thing to look at, source to look at for him. Not only because it's a poem, but because its subject matter is really about mortality, and that is basically what Luthien's and Baron's story became, about dealing with immortality and mortality. And I actually think it might be useful for some people to look at the Pearl and Boethius, and Tolkien would be an interesting separate topic in and of itself. And the other thing I found of great interest was a discussion of the development of the Silmarils. This was done also alongside the Pearl. Christina Scull has a wonderful article about how, as the Silmarils grew in potency and importance, also did Luthien, and they're tied up together. And because when you have a Silmaril has become something that holds the fate of the world, a little dance isn't going to be enough to get it out of the crown. You need something a bit more powerful. And so Luthien moves into, she acquires song, and she also acquires it in and of herself. In the Tale of Tenuville, most of her power is from her mother. They constantly refer to her as, this is a song she learned from her mother, and this is a spell she learned from her mother. And when it gets into Luthien, in the Lay of Luthien, she has power partly because she's the daughter of Amaya, but it's hers. And the song she sings to bring down Morgoth is her own. And if you haven't read the Lays of Beleriand, you should read the Lay of Luthien. And if you only read two parts, I would read the contest between Finrod and Thu, which is wonderful. And then read the entire scene within Morgoth, from her facing down of Carcharoth, and then the scene in front of Morgoth when she takes up her bat wings and literally becomes a nightingale. She's above him, and her song is falling down like rain. And it's beautiful imagery, and she becomes what Beren named her, a nightingale that just quiets Morgoth and the entire house of evil, and the Silmarils blaze forth. And it's absolutely a beautiful, beautiful image. And that's where he went. And it's very frustrating to see such beauty in that song moment and not have her song before Mandos, which she never ever wrote, and it's killing me. But so I felt that it went all the way along. Nice, that's most of what I wrote. And then I get to the end, because after he finished writing the Lay of Luthien, he went up as far as Beren getting his hand chopped off, and then he has, little sketches for what he's going to do that he's written out. The very last thing he wrote, he writes, and Luthien became mortal. Just sort of flat, but not how, why, whatever. And as I say, he eventually worked it out within the Quentin Old Arena. But why was my big question, because it's not evidently necessary. Back in the Book of Lost Tales, he was the traveler Ariel. He goes there, and Ariel's big desire is to become like an elf, and he wants to drink the Limpay and become immortal. And eventually he gets to, and he marries an elf maiden. She has 2 sons, and they go back to England. So the strain of elves come back to England, and that's part of what Tolkien is looking to do. It's the art and the wonder of the English language that is brought back from the elves. But she didn't have to become mortal for that to happen. I mean, even if she Baron got married. And his first thing was she would just fade quicker than usual. But that wasn't good enough. And I did something within my thesis that I tend to tread where Tolkien scholars rarely go, and that is into his personal life. And I was, and I couldn't avoid it, because having made that spreadsheet, you see things going on in his personal life. And it started actually in the beginning, because you could see how, as all the lightheartedness and the childishness in the Book of Lost Tale falls away, he's writing books for his kids. And it's all going in there. There's bits and pieces of it in Roverandom, has a vision of what is essentially the Cottage of Lost Play. And a lot of it, the Tra-la-la-lally in The Hobbit, that's Book of Lost Tales elves. And a lot of it shows up in the Father Christmas stories. So he moves it into what he's doing for his children. And then I went to in reading the various biographies, I looked at the very little bit that is written about his relationship with his wife, and the letter that he wrote to his son after she died. And let me see. Yeah, that he writes to Christopher, and he says, he refers to things that records do not record, the dreadful sufferings of our childhoods, from which we rescued one another, but could not wholly heal the wounds that later often proved disabling. The sufferings that we endured after our love began, all of which, over and above our personal weaknesses, might help to make pardonable or understandable the lapses and darknesses which at times marred our lives, and to explain how these never touched the depths nor dimmed our memories of our youthful love. Forever, especially when alone, we still met in the woodland glade, and went hand in hand many times to escape the shadow of imminent death before our last parting. And I also thought of Leaf by Niggle. And after Niggle goes, he takes the journey and he goes to the workhouse, Purgatory, and then he finally gets his tree, and they take him to where the tree is, and he sees it's a gift. And he's there for a while, but he's having trouble finishing it. And he says, of course, what I need is Parrish. And Parrish was the neighbor whose demands prevented him from concentrating his art. It's his personal life. It's all the life that was outside of what he was creating. And Niggle recognizes, as Tolkien must have, that an artist draws as much from his ordinary life as he does from his scholarship and his other intellectual activities. A person is a whole person, not just a scholar, not just a philologist, not just a musician, not just whatever. You are a whole life, and it includes everybody you touch. And I think when you look at how what people say in the various people, I've read a number of different biographies, what Edith went through for him. When, young lovers rarely anticipate the individual sacrifice which marriage will ask of each partner. Edith broke off one engagement to marry Tolkien, her first love, although he had no prospects beyond death on the battlefield. She had become Catholic for him, which caused her guardians to order her out of the house. Pregnancy was not easy for Edith, and it took her months to recover from John's birth. She enjoyed the social structure of life in Leeds, but the pollution of the city was very bad for the health of the entire family, including Tolkien, who was gravely ill with pneumonia. And the move to Oxford meant a nicer home, but Edith never felt comfortable among the Don's wives, and she did resent the time Tolkien spent with his male colleagues. She had also never felt a true connection to Catholicism, and Carpenter said her feelings became stronger when they returned to Oxford. Tolkien's letter to Christopher shows that he was well aware of the lapses and darknesses which at times marred their lives, and Edward suggests her retirement move to Bournemouth was belated recompense for her years of loneliness. Edith's sacrifices were not so mythic as Luthien's, but Tolkien seems to have been aware that she had consistently put his needs ahead of her own. And this, of course, is circumstantial evidence, and some would say conclusive of nothing, but placing personal life in context with professional study and creative activity can be illuminating, a way of looking at the stock as well as the bones of the soup. Now I close this out with saying that the dancing wife in the Forest of Ruse was the inspiration for Tunuville, the dancer of Doriath. But for the gravestone of Edith Mary Bratt Tolkien, wife and mother, Tolkien chose simply Luthien.
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So, Invoking Wonder is the theme of this conference. My thesis addresses wonder in the sense of curiosity. Because when I read The Fall of Arthur for the first time, when it came out in 2013, I was immediately struck by the strangeness of Tolkien's Guinevere compared to Guinevere in various other Arthurian works. So I was wondering, where did this Guinevere come from? I consider myself more of a Tolkien scholar and less of an Arthurian one, but even I could tell that the Guinevere Tolkien rendered was different from any Guinevere I'd ever seen before in either modern or medieval works. Tolkien's Guinevere is particularly different from William Morris's, which is surprising to me because William Morris was one of Tolkien's favorite authors. Morris wrote a poem called The Defense of Guinevere. So Tolkien's own portrayal of a Guinevere who is a very dark figure is in itself a little bit surprising. Also, it's a departure from the tradition of Tennyson. Tennyson's Idylls of the King was very formative for his generation in terms of Arthurian works, and that is a negative portrayal of Guinevere, but it is, it's still different from Tolkien. Tolkien's is very, I'd say very medieval oriented, so I wanted to examine how that works. My research question was essentially, where did this Guinevere come from, if not from modern or medieval sources? I found an answer in medieval sources actually, but not necessarily as you'd expect the Arthurian ones. So basically I decided that Guinevere in The Fall of Arthur is related to two different traditions, one of Celtic fairies, Celtic fairy lore, and also the tradition of Germanic heroines. So for this talk I'm just going to focus on the Germanic side. I'm really glad to have come to this conference particularly. Yesterday I attended a talk where a gentleman named Mark Painter was talking about his original historical fiction. He was talking about a story set in Anglo-Saxon England, and he said that he was very careful to use an Anglo-Saxon mode when he was describing characters' thoughts. He didn't use the Old English language, but he used words that were usually one syllable or etymologically Old English, something that would relate to the history of Old English. And I think Tolkien is really doing something similar in The Fall of Arthur. It's very obvious on a surface level that what he's doing is metrical Old English poetry, basically. Even though it's written in modern English, it's following the rules of Old English poetry. But more than that, he's doing mimesis on a thematic level, and Guinevere is really a large part of that. So I feel that what Tolkien is doing is really using Guinevere to show off the Germanicness of this work. He's basically asking the question, if we were going to have an Old English, or rather a Dark Ages Arthur story, what would it look like? And Guinevere is one of the ways that he shows that. So in the figure of Guinevere, the Germanic is evoked by several interrelated pieces of her personality and her story. First of all, there's her greed. So let me just read a passage right here that I find very helpful in understanding. To Lancelot her love gave she, in his great glory gladness finding. But cold silver or glowing gold, greedy-hearted, in her fingers taken, fairer thought she, more lovely deeming what she alone treasured, darkly hoarded. Dear she loved him with love unyielding, lady ruthless, fair as Fay-woman and fell-minded, in the world walking for the woe of men. Fair she deemed him beyond gold and silver to her grasp lying. Silver and golden as the sun at morning, her smile dazzled. Her sudden weeping with tears softened, tender poison steel well-tempered. Strong oaths they broke. So if you'll notice in that passage, the repetition several times of silver and gold, this is very obviously a Germanic motif. Treasure and hoards are a central concern of Germanic texts. And one of the reasons for that is the social implications of treasure. In Germanic societies, treasure was hoarded mainly so it could be shared out again as gifts. It was a way of binding the society together. The lord would get treasure and then redistribute it. So Guinevere's particular greed as taking Lancelot to herself, as gold and silver is hoarded, is important in understanding her role in The Fall of Arthur. This is really a way of portraying Guinevere as a hoarder, as somebody kind of like the figures in Tolkien's poem The Hoard, where she eventually finds out that everything comes to nothing. Her hoarding is useless. So I really think that that's one locus for seeing the Germanic in Guinevere is her greed. Another really big one is the calamity that she causes by means of this hoarding. I looked at a couple of different medieval analogs, I suppose you would call them. One of them is Queen Olaf in the saga of Hrolf Kraki. She is a queen who is notoriously greedy, and she brings about her own downfall through her greed. Basically, there's this other king named Helgi who is pursuing her romantically, and he lures her out of her stronghold by means of treasure. He says, "Oh look, there's this treasure in the woods. Let's go find it." And so she is she's lured out of her stronghold by means of her greed. Guinevere has that kind of individual fall, which I will talk about a little bit later. But also there's the social one, which I mentioned earlier. And really the analog that I saw there was Modruth in Beowulf. Modruth is the stereotypical evil queen. She is merciless to her retainers, and she's definitely greedy. She does not share out the gold as she's supposed to. So this is something that I really saw as parallel to Guinevere, because it involves the overthrow of a reign. Basically, Modruth is married off by her father. Her greed is contained because the society cannot bear what her hoarding does in terms of breaking up loyalty relationships between the lord and the retainers. So those are two analogs that I saw. Let's see, other analogs. I think we'll just move on to oaths right now. Oath breaking in particular. If you look at Arthur's warriors as an Anglo-Saxon comitatus, as a band of warriors, Lancelot is sort of the key to that. He's considered the best warrior of them all, and a bunch of other knights are sort of in his retinue. So if he is separated from Arthur, that means that a whole bunch of Arthur's comitatus is going to disappear, and that is what happens. There is a line, which I just read, "Strong oaths they broke." It refers not just to Guinevere's breaking of her marriage oath or Lancelot's to the king. It's the bonds between retainer and lord, which happened throughout the entire Round Table. So basically, I would say that Tolkien's Guinevere, by being put in this situation with gold and silver and oaths, Tolkien is basically showing for sure that she could call Lancelot back to Arthur's side, and she chooses not to. That is a deliberate choice she makes. And that's the way that she will master chance and the tides of time turn to her purpose. It's a very selfish project that she's trying to get Lancelot to herself, ignoring Arthur's downfall as ruinous to the whole society. Basically, she's looking for her own happiness and nobody else's. That particular relationship that she has to trying to master her own doom is something that I see as very Germanic. A lot of the Norse heroes and heroines are always trying to make their own destiny. Brunhild particularly, I looked at in Tolkien's Sigurd and Gudrun. Brunhild the Valkyrie is extremely self-interested. She makes a vow to only wed the world's chosen. And when that does not happen, she has an epic temper tantrum that brings about basically the fall of her family. And that determination that Tolkien's Guinevere shows to, if not marry Lancelot, at least have Lancelot for herself, regardless of what happens to everybody else, I saw as very parallel to Brunhild and the traditions of the Valkyries. Also, something that I saw was the tradition of egging, particularly in Norse literature. I know we were talking about this at the Norse table at lunch yesterday. To egg comes from the Norse verb egja, which is to put an edge on. In Norse literature particularly, a little bit in Anglo-Saxon, but particularly Norse, women do not perform actions by themselves usually to advance the story. What happens is that they put an edge on the men in their lives. They influence them, they ask them to do certain things for them, and that's how the tragic crisis of a Germanic story comes about. Guinevere is kind of interesting because she does not do egging. What she does is the opposite. Instead of egging Lancelot on to join the battle, she says nothing at all. She does not invite him to participate in the battle. So that in itself is kind of an anti-parallel, but I would remark on the key feature of passivity. Guinevere in The Fall of Arthur as a passive character who nonetheless influences the action very strongly is something that I see as parallel to Germanic literature. So basically, just to conclude, I would like to just talk a little bit about how this Germanic Guinevere fits into The Fall of Arthur as a whole. So as I said in the beginning, it's a way of showing what a Dark Ages story of Arthur would look like. Guinevere is also a new character for Tolkien in terms of the depravity of the characterization. I was surprised by that. She's more like Beruthiel or Shelob than some of the other women. So if you consider The Fall of Arthur as sort of a new data point in the canon, it's a way of looking at Tolkien's portrayal of women characters. Because, as I argue, Guinevere really did bring about The Fall of Arthur in this book. So that's something that I think feminist scholars could take a look at in the future. I tried to do it a little bit. I didn't have that much space. So I think a lot more work could be done on Guinevere as a Tolkienian woman. I think that's it.
Okay, thank you.
Hello. I studied C.S. Lewis's Ransom Trilogy for my thesis, and my argument is that the Ransom Trilogy presents Christianity as it should be on Earth, according to Lewis's beliefs. The questions that drove my research were, why does Lewis bring humans into outer space in order to recover Christianity? And why couldn't we just stay on Earth to recover the Christian religion? So, using Tolkien's ideas of escape and recovery that he talks about on fairy stories as a lens through which to consider Lewis's trilogy, I've put together the medieval ideas of the cosmic hierarchy of being and the Great Dance, which Serena talked about earlier. And I put those together with the current events of Lewis's time to answer those questions. He wrote his trilogy during World War II, and there are a lot of connections between what historically happened with experiments in technology and eugenics, with what Lewis created with his NICE, or National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, in that hideous strength. I'll define the cosmic hierarchy of being and the Great Dance, and then discuss the current events of Lewis's time and the popular ideas about improving the human race and how such a mindset can result in human self-abolition, which is the main idea in Lewis's Abolition of Man. Lastly, I'll return back to Tolkien's escape and recovery and explain how both these ideas, when applied to the Ransom trilogy, provide a new perspective for readers on the right way of living and what our place in the universe may mean. So I have a visual, but not with me, so just bear with me in my description. But the cosmic chain or hierarchy of being is basically the relationship between all things that is necessary in order for the universe to function. In the discarded image, Lewis explains that all sentient and non-sentient beings have their own place in the universe, and they naturally try to stay in those places. Each thing has its own unique place or role given to it by God, or in this case, Melalde, in Lewis's fiction. The creator figures are on the outside of the chain because, as creators, God and Melalde cannot actually be part of their own chain. The chain shows everything that is created. So on one side of this visual that you can't see right now, I have the Christian God, and on the other side I have Melalde. At the top of the hierarchy is the place for the beings closest to the creator, and according to Dionysus' celestial hierarchy, there's this triad, or a ninefold order of angels. The top tier of the triad is made up of the seraphim, cherubim, and thrones, which are closest to God. Next are the authorities, lordships, and powers, and those three govern and guide the other celestial beings. The third triad level is made up of angels, archangels, and principalities, which are closest to humans in that they serve as messengers to them from God. On the other side of this theoretical diagram, on Lewis's side, the Oiersu are the equivalent to the celestial seraphim, cherubim, and thrones level because they are closest to Maleldil. Maleldil gives each of the Oiersu dominion over a planet, and they govern the planets in Maleldil's stead. There's a gap for the second level of the angel triad, but the Eldila would be Lewis's equivalent of the angels, or the third level of the triad. And they are the messengers from Maleldil to the rest of the Hanau, or Lewis's sentient beings. Moving down the chain, we have the humans on the Christian side and the Hanau on Lewis's side, which is made up of the humans, Harassa, Saroni, and Vifiltriki. Then below this level, there are animals and non-sentient beings, which are supposed to be shepherded or guided by the Hanau. And lastly, plants, vegetable, and mineral matter. And out of the Silent Planet, Augre, who's a Sorn, explains that each being must be ruled by another and cannot rule itself. He says, there must be rule, yet how can creatures rule themselves? Beasts must be ruled by Hanau, and Hanau by Eldila, and Eldila by Maleldil. This is why the functioning of the chain is so important. It shows that each being is interrelated and that each must take care of the level below them in the chain. The Great Dance is exactly this, and how we discussed earlier. The hierarchy is fluid in that beasts, humans, and spirits all find their place. The celebration that Lewis includes at the end of Paralandra is a depiction of the Great Dance, or the functioning of the chain, where all beings at all times are moving in unison in their given roles. The problem that Lewis writes about in the Ransom Trilogy is that humans mess up the chain when they try to rule themselves or try to become creators or as gods. Weston and Divine plan to supersede where necessary, and this is a quote, the lower forms of life that they find, claiming planet after planet in order to prolong human life. The NICE tries to create a replacement for God, and these things cause the chain in this diagram in Lewis's fiction to be completely disrupted. The trilogy was published from 1938 to 1945, right during the time that Hitler and the Nazis rose to power and the gas chambers were used to kill millions of humans. It's now common knowledge that part of their agenda was to create the Übermensch, or ideal human. And this is one of the main points of my arguments that we'll talk about later. That hideous strength also appears only a week before Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed. And clearly at this point in time, the world is in a state of intense warfare. Scientism was one of the ideas that briefly took hold, and it's basically the belief that the supreme moral end is the perpetuation of our own race, and we should pursue it even at the cost of the things that actually make us human, including sympathy, empathy, our free will, etc. But once people found out about the goings-on at some of the concentration camps, scientism became less popular. For example, Dr. Joseph Mengele, nicknamed the Angel of Death, carried out experiments on Holocaust prisoners, mostly on children and gypsies. According to the Jewish library, he preserved their organs and in some instances severed their heads and preserved them for further study. There wasn't any information about trying to reanimate organs, but you can see how Lewis could have pulled from what was happening at the time in terms of the sciences, since this is so similar to what the NICE does with Alcazan's head. And for those of you who might not have read the trilogy yet, the NICE takes it into a project to behead a scientist and reanimate his head using a bunch of tubes and chemicals. They also call that head the new god created by man. The NICE also does these experiments in order to purify the human species through the sterilization of unfit and liquidation of backward races. Here I have a piece that Weston says of his own intentions. He says, "I'm prepared without flinching to plant the flag of man on the soil of Malacandra, to march on step by step, superseding where necessary the lower forms of life that we find, claiming planet after planet, system after system, till our posterity, whatever strange form and yet unguessed mentality they have assumed, dwell in the universe wherever the universe is habitable. So here it's clear just by the vocabulary that Lewis uses that Weston represents scientists using their power and technology for the wrong purposes, meaning to create and to be as gods rather than to be content with being created by God. If we look more closely at what the NICE has done to Alcasan's head, we can see that it's become a replacement for the Christian God that humans have created. As Weston and Divine look for planets that can support human life so humans can jump from place to place once resources run out, the NICE creates artificial immortality. They reanimate the head, and that artificial immortality allows humans to make themselves creators, to be as gods. Strake tells Ransom that the head is the new God, and he says, "The resurrection of Jesus in the Bible was a symbol. Tonight you shall see what is symbolized. We are offering you the unspeakable glory of being present at the creation of God Almighty. You shall meet the first sketch of the real God. It is a man, or a being made by man, who will finally ascend the throne of the universe and rule forever." We see scientists misusing their technology and their power to move their place in the cosmic chain. Men have created a replacement for God, which was one of the things that Lewis feared and wrote about in The Abolition of Man. His scientists mess with the chain of being in two ways. They try to move up the chain by making themselves mini-gods or creators. And they plan to jump the human race from planet to planet to immortalize humanity at the expense of alien creatures that are already living there. If we maintain our given place in the cosmic chain, God may reward us in his own time. So briefly, I want to talk about deification and how deification is making us as gods in God's own time. So for example, in the Ransom Trilogy, Tor and Tinidril are Lewis's versions of the unfallen Adam and Eve. And they show what Adam and Eve could have been had they not eaten from the Tree of Knowledge. Tor and Tinidril became as gods when Muladil moves them up the chain of being, putting them on the same level as the Oyersu when he charges them with taking care of the planet Paralandra. So using science and our technology for our own gain and artificially improving humans is a complete disruption of the chain of being. And the human disruption of this chain is exactly what Lewis writes about in Abolition of Man. We can bring about our own destruction by looking for ways to improve ourselves through the sciences and not waiting to be deified in God's own time. Now let's return to Tolkien's ideas of escape and recovery as two of the things that fiction does for readers. First, Lewis's trilogy allows his readers to escape from some of the adversities that were brought about by World War II, such as poverty, injustice, and of course death. Those are some of the things that Tolkien lists on fairy stories. Escaping death at this time in particular is more popular, as demonstrated by the Third Reich and the creation of a potential Ubermensch. We see this also reflected in Lewis's work with the NICE and their experiments, which serve as a warning to readers for what might happen if we continue misusing science and eugenics. The big escape here is from human self-abolition. His characters are able to successfully combat the powers that almost destroy humanity, while it seems that humanity is being destroyed in real life at this time. By projecting readers into outer space, Lewis provides recovery for the normalcy of life prior to the war. As for recovery, a few things are recovered for Lewis's readers. First, there's nature's recovering its rightful place in the chain of being. During the banquet at Belbury in That Hideous Strength, which is my favorite scene, the power from the descent of the gods helps the NICE's experimentation animals escape, and they end up mauling most of the NICE members to death, and in doing so, they retake their place in the chain. Nature retakes its rightful place. An image of outer space is also recovered for Ransom as well as for us, the readers. In Out of the Silent Planet, when Ransom is first kidnapped and he looks out the window of the spaceship, he is overwhelmed by what he sees. Instead of the dead, dark, empty space, he sees planets of unbelievable majesty, and constellations undreamed of, celestial sapphires, rubies, emeralds, and pinpricks of burning gold. He experiences space as no one else knows it, and that image allows the reader a new perspective. Lastly, most importantly, is the recovery of the Christian worldview. Ransom's realization that our Christian God is actually the same as Moeldil provides religious renewal for readers, but it also extends to a right way of living, or a mindset. He shows us that Christianity is actually part of something larger spread across our planetary system. Lewis's human-like Tor and Tinadril show us how to treat the cosmic chain of being through example and through their own set of beliefs. The Hanau and all the sentient races we meet are also examples of metahumans, meaning they allow us to look at ourselves from an outside perspective. We, through Ransom, learn through the Parasa and the Saroni how the chain of being should work, and that there must be a system of rulership between all things. So to conclude, the Ransom Trilogy provides a return to the Christian worldview that all things are interconnected in the Great Dance. We've been provided with an example of how we can fix our own cosmic chain, and we've recovered that humans are a small but meaningful piece of a larger chain. Basically, if we uphold our role in the cosmic hierarchy and submit to God's will above our own, rather than looking for something other than that which is given, humans have the potential to transcend the chain when God deifies us in His own time.
Very well done indeed. A lovely panel on that inspiring. I learned so much. Alyssa, are you saying Guinevere is a dragon?
More or less. I actually addressed that in the paper.
Yes, I skipped that for reasons of time, but in my paper I do explore Guinevere as a dragon, basically. Not only does she hoard when she's taking Lancelot's gold and silver to herself, it ties into the destructiveness, the greed. I did look a little bit briefly at, I believe I looked at Beowulf's dragon. I know I looked at the hoard, so for the full information on that, you can refer to the written thesis, because I didn't have time to address it here, but it's a very interesting argument how Guinevere can be related to a dragon. It's a very unexpected comparison. It's something most people wouldn't think of. But I think it's one of the ways that shows how this particular version of Guinevere is related to Tolkien's own scholarly interests. This is clearly something that's idiosyncratic, something he didn't draw from outside tradition. Yes?
On the moral map, which we're drawing of Guinevere's actions, how would you place her escape from Mordred?
I didn't look at it so much as a moral action as part of the passivity thing with the egging and the not acting as opposed to acting. But I believe that's actually one of her few redeeming qualities, is that she does resist Mordred, but I don't think she does it for good reasons. It shows her as a strong character, but it's not that she disapproves of what Mordred is doing. It's very clear that she is very similar to Mordred in having a self-interest. There's actually parallel lines. That's another thing I looked at in the paper. They have parallel lines where they talk about trying to master the tides of fate. Mordred at one point tries to tempt her by saying, would you join me in this enterprise? She says no. But later on, the same lines are used to emphasize that she is herself trying to overcome fate and trying to be self-interested. So ducking Mordred shows her to be a strong character, but not necessarily a morally good one.
Okay, I'm going to ask each of you a question. I have some typical questions that I like to hear from thesis students. I'd like to hear who were some of the most important scholars, or what was like the one or two most important studies that you had to draw on for your piece?
Christina Scull's article about the development of the Silmaril and Luthien sort of developing together. In fact, I recommend anyone, also extremely valuable to me, practically, was Scull and Hammond's 2-volume, soon to be 3-volume chronology and reader's guide. That chronology was a godsend for straightening out where to focus. And I also want to say that in my thesis I referenced a work by Alyssa House Thomas on the very early A version of what Christopher calls the A version of the Lay of Leithian. But So it was very nice.
Literary network.
Yes, it was. It was very nice to do. And, I can't remember, it was another really valuable work on the Pearl. And from my second reader, Kristen Larson, she had a lovely piece on Nienna, which was very nice balance toward the Luthien's quality of pity that she brings to the story in the Lay of Leithian. It's sort of like a growing up of little Tinuviel feels sorry for Beren. Luthien has this well of deep, the kind of pity that Gandalf has. And that happens along the way. At the same time, basically, that Nienna is also growing as a figure and changing to being from this sort of dark person into a font of pity for the whole world. So that was very helpful. And all the biographies. Next.
I was partially inspired by Leslie Donovan's work. She has an article called The Belfry Reflex, which I found very helpful. I think it appears in probably Tolkien the Medievalist. Basically, she looks at several different Lord of the Rings characters and shows how they can be related to various traits of the Valkyrie figure. So I found that very helpful just in opening up my thoughts about Guinevere as a Germanic-inspired character. Also, and this one entered fairly late in the research, there was an article by John Ratliff. Yes, John Ratliff is one. In Tolkien Studies 13, and he was discussing the fall of Arthur through the lens of a setup between pagan and Christian values as they come into a clash. And that helps me think about Guinevere as representative of those pagan values. So when she helps engineer the fall of Arthur's kingdom, she is technically a British character, but she's acting on the side of the Saxons.
I used a lot of Sanford Schwartz and David Downing, particularly Schwartz's Final Frontier and Downing's Planets in Peril. I found those two sources infinitely helpful in kind of the basics of my research. They provided a lot of historical connections and connections between historical events and abolition of man. But I also used one of my secondary reader's essays. My secondary reader was Professor David Mosley, and he helped me with the idea of deification.
Yep, you just found one.
I had to go look at my bibliography. It was Jane Beale's Orphic Powers and J.R. Tolkien's Legend of Beren and Luthien. That was very valuable in bringing in the Pearl and a lot of different things. And of course, Tom Shippey's Road to Middle-earth.
Okay, more questions? Questions?
I have a little comment.
Okay.
Can I just-
Yeah, Kelly has a question, then we'll see. Go ahead, Kelly. Can't quite hear you.
I'm sorry, I'm such a quiet voice. For Alyssa, I know you focused just now on the Germanic side to your thesis, but I'm curious about the Celtic influences you saw, and I know that King Arthur has its roots in Celtic mythology. And so did your work go just to the Celtic sources? The Arthurian sources in Celtic mythology? Or did you kind of do a survey?
Great, so a question about the Celtic sources for Guinevere.
That's actually a really interesting question because similar to the Germanic side, it's not necessarily the Arthurian sources that he was drawing on so much. Of course, the Arthurian legend is Celtic in origin, as you point out. But what I really thought was the component of the Celtic Guinevere is a phrase that gets repeated often, fair as Fay-woman. So I looked more at Celtic fairy tradition, not so much Guinevere in Arthurian works as Celtic fairies, and specifically dangerous female Celtic fairies. So I really saw a lot of that in Guinevere. So I looked at sources like the Lay of Autru and Itrun, which is not authentically Celtic, it's Tolkien's own version of a Breton lay, and some various other sources that have either the loathly lady or a perilously beautiful female fae, all of that kind of thing. So I did see that as coming in.
This was interesting. I had to look up. As Tolkien, he starts writing The Lay of Leithian in 1925, and he finishes it in 31. But near the late 20s and early 30s, he starts also writing The Lay of Gudrun, and then Fall of Arthur, and then The Lay of Uhtred and Uhtred, which have darker females that aren't in The Lay of Leithian. There's like no room there's no Ungoliant in that story. And it almost seems like he needed to do something different. I mean, Luthien was so wonderful and glorious. There was something else to explore. So he was doing that also at the same time.
Another question. Yes, Anne.
This is for Courtney.
Yep.
It's been a while since I've read the Space Trilogy, and I never actually finished it. So, do you think that Lewis was writing it as an examination of his own belief system, like in a way to explore his own beliefs about Christianity using another world, or was it more he's writing it as a cautionary tale sort of thing? Was it what do you find his motivations behind it?
That's great. So a question about whether Lewis is exploring his own belief and faith journey as he's writing the trilogy, or is it more for other people or more for himself? Partly. Good question.
I think he's using certainly his own belief system in order to portray a warning for readers about what could potentially happen, especially in Paralandra. I think we're given the image of another kind of Garden of Eden, and it's a young world. It hasn't fallen yet, and Ransom's job is to prevent it from falling. So we're given an image of what our world could have been if we had done things right. So I think he is presenting his own set of beliefs while also, I don't think he's trying to say this is what you should believe, but this is more of an idea of a path that you could take in order to save what we have now.
Yes, back there.
Do you see the relation between his trilogy and letters?
Well, since Brenton was her director.
Did you want to tell the story
Screwtape?
about the connection, the manuscript? Okay, go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Or you say your thing and I can start.
Okay, so one of the things that Professor Dickinson shared with me was his discovery of a connection between Screwtape and the Ransom Trilogy, and it being the language of Old Solar. So that is what both texts are supposed to have in common. So the language that Ransom learns when he's out in space is the common language of all, like the universe, called Old Solar. And then in one of Professor Dickinson's articles, he talks about Screwtape having also been written and translated from Old Solar. And it just kind of like, like what? So aside from that connection, I would look at Lewis's Unman character. So the Unman was originally Dr. Weston. He's the one who originally wanted to leapfrog humanity from place to place in order to prevent our own extinction. But of course, that would lead to our extinction. So it's kind of a, it's not good. It's not good. So I think I would compare the devils in Screwtape with Weston, and maybe the ideas that the NIC has, just because they share those ideas with Weston. But I'd have to do another reread of Screwtape. It's been a while, so.
get the John Cleese audiobook.
Oh, yes.
If I could just say, because the story is just so fun. So I was there at the Wade Center when Brenton made this great discovery. I was working on the Chapel of the Thorn, transcribing that play. And we're just sitting there working away, and then all of a sudden he kind of like slides this thing over to me. And I read this, and I'm kind of thinking Charles Williams, I start reading, I was reading like, "Nothing shall induce me to reveal to you how my friend Dr. Ransom found these documents and translated them from Old Solar." And I'm kind of like, my eyes just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's a few hours till we go out for lunch, and walk for lunch, and I'm like, what was that? And it turns out it was an unpublished preface to the Screwtape Letters. So we have to be careful with how we handle this material, of course, because Lewis discarded that idea. We did not end up using that, but we can still see that it's somewhere in his world building that he was seeing all these angels and demons and spirits as being part of this whole world, and that they're philologically connected, right? They're connected through language.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating.
Yeah, okay, Courtney, I had the same reaction. I mean, like, I'll never forget, like, where I was standing when Brenton told me that. You know, like, there I am standing in the dinner line at MythCon, holding up the line. What? Yeah, it's incredible.
And Brenton has published that preface and notes and queries, which you can get online. That's just freely available, so do check that out. David.
Yeah, that's, by the way, a very Tolkienian thing to do.
Yeah.
Yes.
In part because Tolkien loved to try and put everything in place. I mentioned in my own paper that Tolkien's characteristic, that tendency, especially in the late 30s, to try and tie in everything else he was writing to the legendarium somehow. You see references even in Father Christmas letters and Roverandom, and you can see the tying in of The Hobbit the same way. And what I was saying in the paper was that The Lost Road began as a separate idea, but was immediately tied in as a kind of sequel to the Book of Lost Tales. I wanted to ask Courtney a question.
Ooh, can I comment on your comment, and then
Yes,
you can ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah, you're exactly right, and of course this pulls in the Dark Tower as well. So I suggested to Brenton that he do work on the Ransom Cycle, because we now have 5 books that are connected by Ransom philologically. And Lewis was doing more of that in that phase of his life, I think, more of the sucking in of all the influences. And that's why we have That Hideous Strength, this like mess of a book, which I love, which is Lewis trying to write a Charles Williams novel, right? And Sandy Schwartz talks about how he's appropriating the Gothic genre in ways that he learned from Charles Williams. So yeah, it's a very Tolkienian move. Okay,
Yes.
and your question.
Yeah, so Courtney, you mentioned about the Nazis and the Holocaust and the various moral aspects of that. I'm wondering how you would actually tie this in to the moral strictures that Lewis proposes here, because most of what Lewis wrote was before this was generally known. So you could say that Lewis was reacting to what was known, or you could say that it was more like Lewis was a clear-sighted thinker who saw where the directions that he was criticizing would go and were going, but not in general awareness at the time. Lewis has tended to be a rather unworldly figure. I don't know how much he would actually have been following the news, especially considering that he had pretty much finished Hideous Strength by the end of 43. But you could take it either way, so I'm wondering how you take it.
I think he was reacting to either rumors, because for a while no one really knew for sure what was going on. So I think there was that possibility of what could humans be doing to other humans. And even without looking at the Holocaust or any of the experiments or any of that, what do humans have the potential to do to each other, let alone other non-sentient beings that we're supposed to be taking care of? So one of the things I talk about in my thesis with the chain of being is how humans are supposed to be the shepherds of all of the other creatures that don't have a voice. But one of the things that we do wrong is use them for our own gain, almost exploiting. So I think he could have been reacting to rumors, yes, but he was also we know that he was also very involved with the news from his BBC broadcasts. And his lecture series, like Mere Christianity, was originally that broadcast. So it was given, I don't know what the time frame was, but it was an ongoing broadcast. So he must have been
World War II.
Yeah.
No, early, yeah.
Yeah. He must have been like well informed about what was or what could potentially have been going on.
Did you bring in Lewis's essay on vivisection?
A little bit.
Let me jump in on that previous question, because I'm sure somebody in the room will know. What is the date of that scenario that Carpenter draws on for his, mock Inklings? Because that's the meeting when they had the conversation about should we forgive the Germans. And I'm pretty sure Carpenter says there that the information about the concentration camps had just hit the news, and Williams had just been commissioned to write the forgiveness of sin. So who has that?
Well, I mean,
has that
that's
date?
January to March 45.
It's about 41.
Yeah, but it was, I think that I don't remember about what was specific on that, but there was a lot of stuff about what was going on in the concentration camps. It did not come out until after the war.
But they had that one conversation that led to the writing of the forgiveness of sins, and should we forgive the Germans, is it our job? Anyway, I think that conversation was early enough that it could have influenced that data strength, but you can check, or somebody can check.
Yeah.
World War I was pretty darn horrible, and gas. And there was enough horror that was beginning to be developed scientifically that you could extrapolate. I mean, that might. You may not know specifics of what and then Nazism started quite early. They knew they hated the Jews. That was well known. Anti-Semitism was alive and well before the war started. So you could extrapolate.
Yeah, that was my suggestion, that Lewis was extrapolating. The other way, Isaac Asimov once wrote an essay suggesting that the use of poison gas in World War I was the beginning of scientific sin.
Oh, wow.
Here's a very interesting thing that I learned on a podcast. There was a German scientist who was very, very nationalistic during World War I, and he was working, and he developed a way to make the poison gas work more efficiently so it would kill the enemy, the non-Germans. And his wife thought it was horrible, and she left him. Well, the guy was Jewish, and he died in a concentration camp with the technology that he had developed. So.
Corey, you wanted to come in on this?
Actually, I had a different question.
Okay, great, and we'll make this the last question.
I just wanted for Kate, first of all, I love your work on Luthien. I got to hear your paper at the Vermont conference.
Yes, that was
which is awesome, where she was talking about, not only about Baron Luthien, but about Eöl and Erythel as like the mirror image
bizarro world
story, which is really cool. But anyway, so I was really, so first of all, it was all I could do when you were talking about Light as Leaf on Linden Tree.
Yeah.
I caught myself before I said, preach it.
Well, I did yesterday in my wisdom.
You're on, Fred.
But yeah, so I love your points on that. And in particular, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about the Pearl connection.
That actually, I would like to do more work on that because I have not read it in the original, and I feel like I need to.
Yeah.
Because it was going on at the same time that he was going through a lot of things. I didn't really discuss this, his personal faith travel. He has a letter in which he tells his one son, I lapsed from the practice of the faith while he was at Leeds, essentially. And when I say, when Tolkien says he lapses from the faith, he was still seeing Father Morgan all the time. And for him, it might have been he was only going to Mass on Sunday, because when he was a boy, he would go every single morning. And later in his life, he also went every single morning. So Tolkien's lapses may, to me, be a faithful practice. But the Pearl going on, the fact that he almost died, which I didn't really mention because he never ever talks about it, so I didn't want to go someplace where I couldn't refer to his own commentary or his parents' commentary, which is, he did. And because it's so much about dying and wanting immortality when you shouldn't, and then the image of the pearl, which Christina Skull was talking about, and Jane Beale also, and it being related to the pearl of great wisdom, and then how they talk about Luthien as being a jewel.
Right, but of course it's also about like the encounter of
With
the mortal man encountering
the one who's
luminous,
immortal, yes,
beautiful female,
Yeah.
right? But of course, there's a river
Yes,
between
yes,
them that
yes.
it can't cross.
That's the Scaldwin.
Right, exactly. And so that idea of like, so the pearl narrative, but Baron who crosses successfully, in a sense, successfully crosses
Yes,
the river.
yes.
There's so much there.
Yes, and actually,
Yeah.
partly that is why, one of the reasons I realized I could not do all the way up to 77, because there was too much to go through just to get to the end of the Lily.
Well, I said with this last question, but I'm going to ask one more, because Alyssa, you have a whole other section on how does Guinevere fit into Tolkien's women. So we don't have time to do it justice, but a few sentences, on comparing her to other women.
Okay, I started to address it a little bit, but I knew we were running short on time. So, Guinevere as a Tolkienian woman is very interesting to me because I did a literature review of basically most of the things that people have said about women in Tolkien, and they fall into a couple of camps. This is pretty well known. I was drawing on work by Robin Ann Reed, just collecting a bunch of sources. And a lot of people say either Tolkien doesn't like women, or the ones he likes too much. He puts them on a pedestal. So women in Tolkien's fiction are either underrepresented or they're represented as exalted, and therefore they're not realistic characters. And I found Guinevere to be actually
Not like that at all.
yes, exactly, not like that at all. So I really do think there's a lot more work to be done. I barely scratched the surface of it.